Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about Japanese punctuation. Now, the first thing we need to know about Japanese punctuation is that most of it is a relatively late arrival in Japanese. Most of it came in during the Meiji era, about 150 years ago. This was when Japan was modernizing, and a lot of the reason it came in was to help in translating Western literature. Now, what this means is that in most cases, Japanese punctuation doesn't have such fixed and structural meanings as the equivalent punctuation does in English and other European languages. So we need to know what the punctuation is doing and also what it isn't doing. So the first mark we're going to look at is the Japanese full stop, or maru, which looks like a little circle at the foot of a letter. And this is really the exception to the rule because it really is structurally clear. What it does is end a sentence. And this is very important for us in understanding how complex Japanese sentences are structured. Why is that? Well, Japanese is a very modification-heavy language. That's to say, a lot of what other languages do by other strategies, Japanese does by modification. That's to say, using clauses to modify nouns or other elements of a sentence. Most of the heavy lifting in Japanese structure that's not done by logical particles is done by this modification structure. So whole logical clauses can be used not as logical clauses but in order to modify a noun or some other element. So let's take a look at how this works. Ichiba de katte, kawa ni otoshichatta okashi. And this means the candy that I bought at the market and done dropped in the river. Now, the problem with this when we're reading a complex sentence is that we can get confused about whether something is a logical clause or not. So are we saying here that I bought something at the market? No, we're not saying that. Are we saying that I dropped something in the river? No, that's not what we're saying in this sentence. Both of those things are just modifying okashi. They're telling us what kind of an okashi it was, the one I bought at the market and done dropped in the river. So all we have here is a single noun, okashi, that's been heavily modified by logical clauses that aren't working as complete logical clauses. We can then add a logical particle to that okashi and make it into a full logical clause. So we might say, Ichiba de katte, kawa ni otoshichatta okashi ga sakana-san ni taberareta. The candy I bought at the market and done dropped in the river got eaten by a fish. But how do we ensure when we're reading a sentence like this whether we're looking at a logical clause or whether we're looking at a modifier? Now, the important thing to understand here is that in any kind of Japanese writing, except perhaps on Twitter or something, a logical clause has to end in one of two ways. Either with a maru, which tells us that it's the end of the complete sentence. It may have a couple of sentence ender particles after it, but it's a very strict rule of Japanese that what ends any logical clause is the B engine, aside from any sentence ender particles, or it has to end in a clause connector that completes the clause and leads into the next clause. This may be the te form, it may be a word like kara or keredo, but armed with that information, we can then see what's going on. So let's look at Ichiba de katte, kawa ni otoshichatta. That's a complete pair of logical clauses. It's not telling us what it was that we bought in the market and dropped in the river, but it could perhaps be presuming that. But we know that it's not in fact a logical clause because it doesn't end in a clause connector and it doesn't end with a maru. It goes straight into a noun. And this is how we can tell the difference between a modifier and a logical clause. And we know when the entire sequence, the entire sentence is over because it's going to have that maru. And I've done a video about this method of analyzing Japanese sentences, and I'll link that so that you can follow it up afterwards. But the maru here is vital. Now, the next one we're going to look at is the Japanese comma, which looks like a little diagonal line at the foot of a letter, and that's kind of the opposite of a marrow because it really is not a logical element in the sentence. It was adopted into Japanese, but unlike the English comma or other European commas, it has no logical rules. Ideas like sectioning off a subordinate clause with comma at each end, that doesn't exist in Japanese. You just put in a comma wherever you want to indicate a pause, and that's all it does. In Japanese schools, students are discouraged from using too many commas. And the reason for this is not incorrect comma usage, because there is no such thing as incorrect comma usage in Japanese. The reason is that commas are not a structural part of Japanese, so students are discouraged from using them as a crutch in conveying their meaning. If you can't convey your meaning without commas, then you're not writing good Japanese. Now, the next one we'll look at is the question mark, or hatena. Now, in English, the question mark is subject to a rule. If you have a question, you have to end it with a question mark. And also in English, questions are structurally different from statements. So if we say the coffee is hot, that's a statement. But if we say, is the coffee hot, that's a question. In Japanese, we don't have this differentiation. Statements and questions are structured exactly the same. Now, in formal Japanese, we have the question marking particle, ka, which tells us that it's a question. But in informal Japanese, we can use ka, but mostly we don't. Sometimes we use the question marker no, but that's ambiguous because no can also be a statement marker. The only way you can really tell a question from a statement in Japanese is the rising intonation, which of course you can't hear in text. And so the question mark has become a very useful tool for indicating that rising intonation, for telling us that this is a question, not a statement. In English, you have to use the question mark at the end of a question if you're writing proper English. In Japanese, there's no such rule. If the ka marker is there, you don't use the question mark. But if you want to disambiguate the fact that something is a question rather than a statement, you just pop in a question mark if you want to. The next thing we'll look at is quotation marks. These look like little square brackets at the ends of a statement, and they work exactly the same as English quotation marks. They just tell us that something is a quotation. It's what somebody's saying. We don't use them for what somebody's thinking, as we sometimes do in English. Now, sometimes you'll see double quotation marks like this, and what they do is mark a quotation that occurs inside another quotation. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is something that really puzzles people quite a lot. In Japanese, particularly Japanese books, you'll sometimes see, especially in vertical text, a set of little marks that look a bit like Japanese commas running along the left-hand side of a word or a phrase. What on earth is this doing? And nobody seems to tell you. What it's actually doing is either emphasizing that word or phrase or telling us that it's being used in a special sense. So what these little marks are really doing is something like putting something into italics in English. And I suspect they came into Japanese in the first place to render italicization when translating Western literature. There's no way of really writing Japanese characters in italics. There is no italic format for Japanese. So this is what's used instead. This emphasis and the indication that something's being used in a special sense can also be indicated by katakana, but you will see this from time to time in Japanese texts, and that's what it means. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels who make these videos possible, and all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere. My red Kokeshi, my blue Kokeshi, my pink Kokeshi, every one of you is valuable to me, and so are all of you who comment and like my videos or just come here to watch them. Thank you, all of you, for helping us to make Japanese as simple as it really is. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.